thank you for reading our evidence. We know there's a lot of it. It could have been much longer. We've spent a year working on this campaign. We could have said a lot more. We make no excuses for that. It's a year's work and it's conversations with 20,000 people. And because your job as scrutiny, as a scrutiny committee, is partly to amplify the voices of the public and issues of concern from the public, we really look forward to seeing how you will do that. We were originally asked if we would sit as part of a panel, and we said we were more than happy to do that, but we really must have our own slot because we were the people. We are the reason you are here today, because of the campaign that we have run. And I want to say first a little bit about our own experience of Sheffield City Council governance as an unfunded community group. Our experience of working with councillors in the ruling group and in the leadership and in the cabinet is of unreplied to letters, no responses to telephone calls, inordinate delays in responses, a reluctance to have discussions, promised meetings that never happen. And then we have a whole range of things that are about somehow trying to, I would put it as strongly as in a sense, to kind of diss It's Our City and what we were doing. So we have a whole range of people saying this is a Lib Dem Green alliance, councillors talking out in public, on social media, insulting us. We have people saying we're lying. We have individual aggression from, again, I'm sorry to say, elected members out on the streets. And then we have our experience of desperately trying to raise the issues with you throughout the year, coming, raising questions. That was the only way in we had. Little or no response. Being very concerned that the authority was going to be in a position to potentially have to spend £200,000 on a referendum when we could have been having discussions all last year, and here we are. And you know, I don't mean to be in any way horrible. You described on Tuesday the full council as a bear pit. And indeed, your contribution to the debate when we triggered a debate, another effort to try and get you to respond, was to stand up and say, talk about 7,000 people blackmailing the city. This is not right. This is not okay. And then through the summer, we see in the press.
Can I just respond to that?
Can I
just respond to that?
Yeah,
because you made an accusation that is not actually true. What I was trying to point out was that at that particular meeting, a petition of 7,700 and something was presented, and then there was an attempt at that point to change the way the governance system of the city was, to change it. And what I said was that a petition of 7,700 people was not representative of the viewpoints of the 600,000 people that live in this city. That's what I said.
Thanks. What I'm trying to get across is an experience, and that's fine. And I, absolutely take that response. We then had reported in the press over the summer that the leader had apparently been in negotiations with us all summer, and we'd had no contact with her. And then we come to this point, and suddenly there's talk of we need to talk to the 95%. There is no 95%. Clever politics, there is no 95%. We went out randomly and talked to people. And 80 to 90% of people we talk to really desperately want to sign the petition, right? So it's how big a sample you want to make a legitimate point. It's not we didn't go out and find the nearly 7,000, you know, the whatever it was. How many people did we get? We didn't go and find the nearly 7% who wanted to sign the petition, therefore everybody else didn't. We went out randomly. So to then, we need to talk to the 95%. There is no 95%. 80 to 90% of people, when we went out and talked to communities all across the city for a year, wanted to sign the petition. Now, I realise that I've put something quite challenging on the table there, but all it is to make the point that if our experience of governance, trying to influence decision-making, our concerns is how our citizens listen to, how are we enabled to influence. And we had to use a statutory mechanism to get this conversation. And if our experience is replicated in any way, it's not a good sign. Could I ask you please to put up the third graph? This uses data from 2 big Sheffield surveys carried out independently. They're called the State of the Voluntary Sector Survey, 2016 and 2018. The grey bar is 2016 and the black bar is 2018. And this asks the voluntary and community sector, coordinated by Voluntary Action Sheffield, and when Mad is here later, she may want to you know, she may pick up on it. That as part of this big survey, they asked the community and voluntary sector, a vast array of organisations across our city, from people like us who are completely unfunded up to the big voluntary sector, whether Sheffield City Council informs, consults, involves and is responsive to them. And if you look at the patterns there, this shows a really worrying pattern. Only 15 and 16% across that community and voluntary sector feel that Sheffield City Council involves and responds to them. But I just park that there. It's difficult starting with our own experience because that is our experience, yeah? And our concern in terms of governance is how citizens are enabled, how citizens are listened to and at the heart of and enabled to affect power and influence in terms of their own communities and in decision-making in the city. And it was really interesting, the brief discussion there was on Tuesday about what governance is and have we got a working definition and what the parameters of the discussion. Because someone can, well, yes, it is decision-making. But of course that hides a whole lot of things. Yes, governance may well be about decision-making. The UN, for example, also say it's about how decisions are implemented. But it's about decision-making. But that hides a lot, because when you think about governance, what you're thinking about is all the players, all the people, and the ways they are enabled to, or not, formally and informally participate in that decision-making. So, I also talked a bit about, in my question on Tuesday, I mentioned the importance of purpose. What is the purpose of governance? Because governance isn't a technical or a neutral exercise. It's not just a set of procedures. It's not a technical thing. It's not a neutral thing. It does something. And I was very interested in one of the slides Jay put up when Jay was talking on Tuesday through some of the council work. And he had a slide called Initial Steps. And it said training, learning and development, better guidance, encouraging more creativity and innovation, engaging citizens in the work of scrutiny, increasing a focus on other public services. And that was initial steps. And you want to say, yes, but for what purpose? What is the purpose of Sheffield City Council's governance? And that's why I think all the experts say that the design principles are really important, because they give you a direction, and those are political questions, if you like. Yeah? So the design principles are really, really important. But in a way, I'm talking about something even more fundamental about the purpose of governance. Is the purpose of governance, I mean, how could we describe it? I mean, I think it's really a question worth thinking about. Is the purpose of governance to ensure that, as far as possible, the arrangements we have for organising our affairs are to maximum public benefit, for example? I mean, that's quite general. You can get more specific. You can say, what is the purpose of Sheffield City Council's governance? It's not neutral and it's not technical. And if you treat it in that way, what you're doing is maintaining a status quo, which people might not like. The two big things we've tried to talk about in our evidence, are the importance in governance of representation and of participation. Can we put the first graph up, please? So graph 1 shows the electoral mandate by the electorate and vote share at the last local elections. So we can see that the ruling group there has, I have to apologise, it's not 9.3%, it's 9.7%. I did these calculations months ago, and when I came to do them again for this graph, I couldn't work out why it had gone wrong. Somewhere my maths has gone wrong. It's 9. The numbers of the people who vote for the ruling group in this city represent 9.7%, less than 1 in 10 of the people who of the electorate. And we know the electorate, as you've pointed out already, is actually bigger than that anyway, because not everybody's registered. And we have in this little black block at the left-hand side of the graph, formally in the Constitution under the strong leader model, as it operates here in Sheffield, all the cabinet posts, all the scrutiny chairs, a system of effectively deleting all motions from other parties. And of course, after May, next May, it's just possible that that might be another party there. All the cabinet posts, all the decisions, all the scrutiny chairs. And the question is, how does one vote how does one organise things? How does one govern democratically in a city when you have a less than 1 in 10 voter mandate? And many people would say that one of the really important things about governance is to try and represent, to build the mandate, is to work across, is to try and work beyond that less than 1 in 10 mandate. Because apart from anything else, you're missing out on a huge amount of support that Sheffield communities could give you. And as we say in our evidence, it is extraordinary, the negativity expressed towards this council and towards the decision-making of this council. And quite often it's our city volunteers were reminding people of austerity. We're talking about the difficult jobs you have, etc., etc.
But we have got sort of movable time slots for the different contributions. And are you anywhere near getting to the end?
We can certainly
what you wish to say, so
yeah,
I can allow time for questions.
We've also put in a graph about a comparison to the core cities, which I'll park there. But the other big agenda is, of course, about participation. And the big question here is, what are the mechanisms that exist in order for communities, interest groups, stakeholders to influence and participate in the governance of this city? And I don't know the history of community mechanisms in this city and what might or might not have gone wrong. Can you go to the very last slides, the way after the photos? Nottingham City Council, for example, they have a whole network of local neighbourhood committees, very active. I've just put that up as an example of the kinds of, you know, the variety of people who tend, they have eight active area committees, based on 2 or 3 wards. They're meeting regularly. All the councillors attend. Lots of officers and police and so on attend. They're dealing with issues of, they're making decisions. They're making decisions and spending budgets. They're dealing with issues of antisocial behaviour, litter, all those things that local communities have real concerns about. They're making those decisions and they're participating in the decision making. We have nothing in Sheffield, and I think one of the biggest concerns is the exclusion of the community and what we might call community voices in the public from any mechanism. We are confined to asking public questions almost completely. And the very nature of asking public questions, I mean, it's quite intimidating. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. So lots of people aren't going to do it anyway, particularly people who tend not to have a voice. It already feels like a quite adversarial environment. And by the time you come to ask a public question, what are the mechanisms? And we have no mechanisms. It seems to me they're very much at the gift of this, initiatives. Also, they are not embedded, they are not routine, they are not everyday. And if we don't have a principle around governance of we want to devolve power down to our communities as far as is possible and so on. The thing I haven't talked about as a kind of headline is what we've said about scrutiny, because I can see just how much phenomenal detailed work is done in scrutiny. But what we're saying is that the evidence isn't there to demonstrate its impact. And indeed, the expert said the other day, you know, doesn't really have any. There is phenomenal work, and I've seen it in just reading the paperwork, and it is lost, right? But once again, public and community voices are almost completely excluded from that. And I mean, maybe excluded is the wrong word. They're not part of that. They are not part of that. So I will stop there, but Wal, I know, wants to say a couple of words.
Yes, I'll keep it very short. Basically, I'm just going to go through very briefly the section 2, which is on page 2 of our evidence, which is the Community Principles for a Modern Committee System, which is a separate document as well on our website. So we've, having spoken to the 20,000 people, 20,000 conversations, It's Our City has come up with these 4 principles that you could look at for a modern committee system. So it's fair and meaningful representation, increased participation, a cultural change, and setting clear standards. So we've come up with these principles from the conversations. And in this document, or in section 2, we've tried to come up with some very specific proposals to sort of give you some ideas of how that might actually be implemented. So, for example, for fair and meaningful representation, we've got all councillors should have a meaningful voice. So, and that implies some different structure, different mechanism for giving all councillors a voice. Increased participation, to actually have stakeholders and communities embedded in the decision-making process. In the evidence document, we didn't really go into very much detail about cultural change, but a move to a different decision-making system would involve a big cultural change, and that would be quite difficult for. It's quite a difficult process for councillors in particular to go through, to change from one system to another. and that would involve maybe some training and a different way of looking at how they work. So it's really just to highlight those principles that we came up with. I hope you can read it if you haven't read it already in more detail about the proposals that we've come up with. Thank you.
And I'll finish off by adding a sentence. One of the panaceas for better governance and local democracy is often people say it's about participation. We know that the reality of participation is actually really difficult, and communities where people have a lot of social capital and financial capital are more likely to have a louder voice. That is not a reason for not having that voice, but it is a reason for ensuring that disadvantaged communities are enabled to have a voice. And the reason why participation and representation go together is because participation is difficult. It's a long-term, ongoing project, although some places do it very successfully in their governance mechanisms. The reason it has to go hand in hand with better representation, so that people's voices can be represented in the decision-making of the council, is because it is acknowledged that there are some people who may never. And the point is you have to have better representation because that affects everybody understanding. And lots of councils have gone to things like the Wigan deal, you know, people talk about, or various understandings of relationships between councillors and community and so on. We'll stop there. But I do want to make a comment. We knew this would not be long enough, but we have talked to 20,000 people. Right? And we needed a much bigger slot. And as I say, we're really interested in how you will amplify that and take that on board.
Thank you, Ruth. Unfortunately, the timescales aren't conducive to large-scale, lengthy contributions, etc. As somebody once said, you know, we wouldn't be starting here, really, would we? But we are where we are. I'm going to take questions from members of the committee.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. The particular thing I'm just interested in, and I think it is a powerful slide you use, just the fact that we have such poor voter turnout, and that's I think that's whatever happens, that's been a fact for some time now, and in some cases that's been declining. Some wards that's been declining. I'm unclear from what you've presented, and I think it's good stuff, but how you would see that as increasing, because for me the fundamental issue about democracy at the moment locally is the fact that, as you point out, that it's under 10% in terms of mandate, and I think that all of us kind of need to be mindful of that. I'm just unclear how you would see from this. I'm just worried that we go along a route of improving things, changing things, but then still have, you know, under 10% mandate.
Well, you may always have a 10% mandate. I mean, if the Lib Dems take over in May, they may have 11 or 12% because we know that Lib Dem voters vote more. You know that it's quite stark. Apart from the city centre, it's actually all the Labour votes, the wards that have the lowest turnout. If you can rank them, absolutely, just straight the way through. You have a service, I think, which has been under review, and I don't know all the details, Jim, I think they're called locality managers. I think that service has been in review for quite some time. I've met a couple of those workers. They're really good. They're really, potentially, really skilled at working with communities, right? If you can't get people to vote, and there are lots of reasons why people vote. It isn't about apathy or lack of interest or consent or, you know, people are really disengaged, and we know that nationally. You know, people are really turned off to local politics. And at the same time, what's so bizarre in Sheffield is that they're profoundly interested, and people are massively active in their local communities. And all that happens despite this disconnect, right? So it may be that there are never bigger mandates. It may be that politics is changing, right, to have a much more diverse spread. So it still comes back to the question, how do you do things democratically? And surely what you have to do is governance are arrangements that are the arrangements that we come to that maximise the public good. So you have to work in more consensus-based ways, for example. You have to build your support. You have to build your legitimacy. And that is often done, and has historically been done, through effective community development strategies, right? Where people do have a real voice, they do have a real power, and they do have a say over decisions that affect their lives close to them and at local level. And I have absolutely no doubt that there is huge potential in Sheffield for that kind of bedding down of localised decision-making, and that can be done very effectively. And I've seen some of your workers, and I think some of them seem like they'd be really brilliant at working with diverse communities, right? And, you know, those kinds of meetings could feed into, say, a communities committee, the Safer Communities Committees, and that can pan out. But it's also about involving other stakeholders, because those people, those 70% who don't vote, they have contact with all kinds of agencies, right? And there is a resistance amongst councils. Everybody talks the language of participation, but the studies that have been done show that there's a resistance within councillors, and it's always around, yeah, but they're not representative. Well, we've already debunked that. We're not really representative here. Right? There's a resistance because it's a feeling that people are not representative, so they can't possibly speak. Yeah? I mean, in Nottingham, that example I showed you, they are self-appointed community reps, and they commit to a number of from community groups, and they commit to a number of things in order to be a representative, a community representative, including talking to their local communities, talking to their neighbours, feeding back into the right. But that's how you start. You've got to start building those connections, haven't you? And those linkages. And you know, you rather than operate. I mean, the way I think about it, and many people would say I was wrong, but the strong leader model, what it enshrines is a cabinet who are defined as the decision makers, rightly or wrongly, whether or not they are defined formally as the decision makers, along with a small group of senior officers. And that's the bubble. That's the bubble. And no one can break in. And you have to open that out.
I think, Jim, if you look at the, maybe from a different angle, if you look at the evidence of the conversations, which Anne mentioned some of it in her presentation at Nigel's event, you can see that there's a really deep, for some people, a deep disengagement from the council, because people don't believe that they're listened to at all. And surely that if they could see the effect and see that they could actually influence things more, then surely that would influence voter numbers.
And they hate consultations. They hate consultations. They hate being engaged with. They want to be part of the decision making. And I know there are statutory consultations and so on, but they think it's a joke. It has to be meaningful. You know, if you think of an idea of like there has to be a win in every ward, right? What's the community win going to be in every ward? And you know, because the lack of trust is so profound, and many issues, and you know, people never mention the tree issues, but you know, that is the one. People know that mistakes get made, and they are quite pragmatic. We often get an obsession about accountability, and I noticed people talking about it a lot the other day in the experts. Actually, people are quite pragmatic, but I tell you, there's one issue across the city where people say that people should be held accountable, and they say it was terrible what they did to those tree people. Yeah? That's the one issue that we hear again and again. But people are actually quite pragmatic about accountability, right? They do want people to be held to account, but they're much more interested in trust, openness, honesty, involvement, and so on.
We move on to the next question, Ruth, please. Yeah, okay.
It was really just a Just a very short response to that, because I do think what you've said is fair enough in terms of having democratic structures that kind of reflect such low turnout, but I've probably spent too much of my life working with people who have been denied the right to vote, and I just think that it's an issue for all of us, whoever the administration may be in future, about how we live with a mandate like that. And I think that's not about the structures, that's actually about a wider administration. And Sheffield is not alone in that. I think it's interesting, the comparison even with Nottingham that you've got about the you know, where the 62% in terms of the ruling group have the mandate there, it's still a low turnout. So I'm not sure that necessary structures kind of actually heighten the
But when you see you have an impact, if you could see that you have some impact, I mean, it's all around community, good community development work and political education, isn't it, as well?
Work out how this thing works, sorry. Right, okay. Well, first of all, thank you, and I think that was a bit of a tour de force by you, Ruth, if I may say so. That was a kind thing. Equally passionate about really big on governance. Oh, sorry, Mick, that I frightened you. And the reason I wasn't here on Tuesday was because I was at an Improving Governance in Fire Services conference. My anorak is behind me. We've also, as a result of you stirring us up like this, been out on visits to look at different systems, and we have visited councils where they have moved from a committee model to the cabinet and leader model. We've also met with somebody, Steve, you were there, when they are going in the reverse direction, the direction you hope we will go in. And we also visited Rotherham, where they have reformed and adapted the leader and cabinet model such that the things that I had talked about, where you said I had sounded sensible, where they have pre-policy scrutiny and the opposition and the administration, if you like, in scrutiny, all work together. We met the leader of the opposition, who was a Brexit Party councillor, who was enthusing about the way that he and the councillors of his group are able, through this mechanism, to also put in changes and such that before something goes to the cabinet to be agreed, they have played a full part in poking away at the proposed policy, improving it, taking bits out, etc. They also have a model whereby the individual cabinet members do not have individual delegated powers. The power is delegated to the actual cabinet as a committee, and that is how decisions are made. So I think what I wanted to ask you was, are you wedded to the proposal that you have of committees, or would you recognise that if there was a good reformed model along the lines of what Rotherham do, and we're having evidence from one of the Rotherham people next week, I think, and I suggest you come and have a listen to what they have to say about their version. Would you consider that really improved, good scrutiny, pre-policy scrutiny version would have its merits, or do you think we can only have a committee a change to a committee type model? Hang on.
I'm only one individual, and I don't know what other people, it doesn't matter what I think. And I mean, the work of this committee, the most important thing is that you come out with design principles for the modern committee system, because that's what the referendum's going to be about. But I'll say a couple of things about what you said. One of the problems is that the way the strong leader model at least appears to have worked in Sheffield has been really quite top down. It hasn't appeared to be, it's gone on for many years. It has been with a very low voter mandate, and it's tainted. But I think that it's an impression, and I don't know what the others think from talking to so many thousands of people, is that the fit for this city is something that embeds a more horizontal model. Because you can play around with the strong leader system, you can delegate as many powers as you want, but the nature of, in the very essence of the system, is that ultimately you can draw powers back. It's in the gift of the leader, right? That is the model. That was the intention. That's not Sheffield City Council's responsibility or fault. It was to draw power to the executive, right? And that model is not a good fit for a community-minded city like Sheffield. I think that's the issue. But there was one other thing I wanted to say. Does anyone else want to say anything about that? So, whereas the LGA or the Centre for Public Scrutiny might say they're neutral about the models, it can work either way. Of course, they have to say that in their professional role. And I think we would say that for Sheffield, it is objectively better. Because it does share power, it does implicitly in its design, and that is what we've heard from people is a much better fit. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I think personally, I think I would say a similar thing in that speaking to many people, that a committee system, a modernised committee system, is a much better fit for what people think how the council should work. People, when you speak to people, they have no idea that it's actually run the way it is. What they think it's run on as a committee system. They're completely shocked that it isn't. So for me personally, I believe that a modernised committee system would fit what most people think it should be.
And can I make one more comment about...
Sorry, yeah, I was going to come back.
Sorry, can I just add one more comment about this idea of pre-decision scrutiny? I think we can get kind of tied up in language quite often, and I'm probably one of the worst offenders. But this language, scrutiny, is a made-up thing. Scrutiny, you know, we may be all used to it now, but it's a made-up thing. It's an artificial thing. It separates the so-called decision maker from the investigation, right? And right from the earliest days, first Select Committee report on the working of the Local Government Act said actually what happens when you see the best governance is when it's blurred, right? And that's a modern committee system. A modern committee system incorporates a collaborative, that you take the factors that matter into account when you make the decision. One of the best call-in discussions I saw, fantastic work around special needs, around short break holidays. It was called in by UMIC, a really careful, long, thought-through discussion. You didn't ask them to change the decision, but you did make about 5 really thoughtful, careful, which was going to mitigate the impact on a group of people who one would want to support. They were rejected, of course, but if that had been the discussion around the decision, that would have been the decision, right? And a modern committee system, we're talking about pre-decision scrutiny. All we're talking about is good decision-making, where you take into account the factors that matter.
I'm going to have to hurry.
Yeah. I was going to say that what you're describing that the call-in did is what they do in Rotherham, and it does work because it is part of the before the decision is made. So your description of being able to do that is something that they are already doing. So that would be a possibility here. Can I also ask how you see fast decisions being made? Because at the moment we talk about the need to do quick decision making and to be able to take stuff when we're working with partners and be able to say, yes, this will happen, yes, we can guarantee that, yes, we can commit these things, and it's something that cabinet members are able to do. And one of the reasons for having this particular model was so that there can be people who are accountable and people who are able to cut through and do things quickly. How will your modern committee version make sure that stuff can be done speedily when necessary?
All councils that change to a committee system put in place some mechanism. It's a concern of all councils that change to a modern committee system that speed might be an issue. Actually, if you look at what's reported, is that many councils have never used that speed decision mechanism that they put in place because they were worried. I think you also have to question whether, one, how many decisions, there may be day-to-day and operational decisions that have to be made quickly, but how many decisions actually need to be quickly, and also whether there's any evidence that the strong leader system has made decisions quick. You know, when people talk about the local plan and so on, and actually people quite mostly want better decisions, not wrong decisions. And there's been a number of examples. You know, they want the right decisions. They want a thoughtful, responsive council, not necessarily a quick one.
That's what we heard.
That's what we heard. Yeah. The accountability a bit of it, though, is in being held accountable. Most people told us that they thought there was no accountability in Sheffield City Council. They were never held accountable for this, that and the other. And people I know are still trying to. So again, accountability is a difficult one, because in a modern committee system, actually, it does blur lines sometimes, but it means that we all have power and we are all responsible, and we need to be responsible for our own and accountable for our own bits.
And communities would also be part of that accountability, because they would be embedded in the decision making system.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. I've been 18 months for councillor, and my life in the private sector, and a long-standing school governor, chair of governors, primary and secondary. So I've got a good understanding of governance, because governance works in the private sector as well as the public sector. A board holds an executive to account. A governing body holds the senior leadership of a school to account. This is no different. We must remember that the cabinet is there to set the direction of the city, and the executive to deliver. What matters, and you said it, what is the purpose of governance, is the relationship between scrutiny and the cabinet. And you mentioned Mick calling something as important as send in. It shouldn't have to be called in. It should be a natural relationship between the relevant cabinet member and the scrutiny committee. And that, to me, is the hub of this. I'm not sure whether the mechanisms is the issue. It's about the relationship between the cabinet and the councillors and the representatives that sit on the relevant committees and hold the cabinet to account. And I think that's where you're trying to come from here. So, my question is, you've mentioned purpose of governance. You talked about public benefit. We as the councillors are elected by the public. We're there to give the views of our constituents, because we are working with them. I can tell you my caseload pile is up here. We're working with them all the time. We know the feelings that are out there. That's our role. And we're here to bring that into this organisation to impact. The issue is, how does that happen? and how does the government be made to work to ensure that better decisions are made at the top? Thank you, Chair.
Very quickly respond. I mean, I suppose the statement that the executive are there to set the strategic direction, make the policies, and I suppose we are fundamentally questioning that on a 9.7% mandate, right? And every time the strategic direction, every time voices of whether it's the opposition or whether it's other backbenchers are not, you are unable to represent voters and members of the public and communities in decision making. The thing about, you know, community voices and being accountable to community, one of the problems of your scrutiny reports, it seems to, your scrutiny minutes, it seems to me, is there is almost no evidence of impact. And lots of councils have done of that making a difference. And that may be just that it's been difficult to demonstrate that, right? But certainly no decisions have changed, no, you know, it's, there are generalised claims in the annual scrutiny reports, but it isn't backed up by evidence. And the almost hermetically sealed against the voice and influence of communities, which is what it feels like to people out there, and looks like on paper, because all we can do is come and ask a question, and we're not actually involved in any way, and there's no mechanism for community decision-making feeding in, yeah, there is almost no evidence that I can see of any impact, of it making any difference whatsoever. And I can see the quality of the discussions, but I can't see, personally, can't see where it goes. And there is some fantastic work. And, you know, probably the most common you know, the committee systems are as various as the committee systems. But it's the commonest, I think, is to retain a small scrutiny committee around particularly health scrutiny functions because of the real demands of some of that and because of the risks involved. But a modern committee system should actually build in the functions of scrutiny in terms of its decision making, and can do.
A bit strict because, okay, Douglas, but Nigel is already probably about half an hour beyond the time that he's supposed to be contributing, but Nigel's smiling, so we'll carry on.
He's already walking out.
You can go first if you want to.
He's just gone to the toilet, and I may have to disappear for a couple of minutes because I'm in the middle of a coughing fit. Mike, you want to come back? Yeah.
Yeah, just to make a brief comment, but at the end of the day, unlike other organisations, the people of this city have a choice once a year in the vote to determine the direction of where they want to go, and that's where it should take place.
Tim.
Right, I was young once, and I actually had the misfortune in the early 90s being on the council which had no political whipping. It was the craziest time of my life, and whenever I asked about who allowed that to happen, in the past, they'd say, oh, that happened when there was no party political. It was all backroom deals, stitch-ups, mates, that sort of thing. And so I'm not that keen on to repeat that experience of my first 2 years in the council anyway. So basically, questions I've got several questions I asked at once. Have you got any evidence of increased voter member public participation when there's a change going back to committee? Is there any evidence you've got, any evidence base that it's increased voter turnout, people engagement? So yeah, because
some councils have specifically had that as one of the aims of their changing to a committee system. So they've evaluated against that, and they've all said they've achieved that, and that is often in centre of public scrutiny reports where they've evaluated change. So where councils, where the purpose has been, say if one of your design principles is we want to involve more people in decision making, we want to devolve power downwards as communities to be able to take real decisions closer to that affect their lives. You would then evaluate that, and councils have done that, and so there is some evidence through the Centre for Public Scrutiny. But these are questions you should be asking experts.
The whole basis of this is that there should be a change to committee system.
Centre for Public Scrutiny
Okay,
documentation.
I'll link that.
And in the paperwork, there is frequently the reference to evidence-based change.
Another one of these is the first graph you produced was about councils and comparatives about declining public confidence. I think this isn't just Sheffield, this is around the world, this is everywhere. And I'd like to have seen some evidence where you're comparing Sheffield City Council against others. I mean, I'm not arguing with you that it's not been badly run over the last few years. What I'm saying would like to see is that there's evidence comparing that there's been a much steeper decline in public confidence in Sheffield against other councils. Have you got any of that evidence there?
Well, unless you take voter turnout figures. But what we're doing is trying to report back and understand what people said to us, right? And if you want that kind of evidence, you need to ask the experts. If you should be doing your own comparisons, right? If that's, yes. And it is to report back on what people said to us. Many people said to us that they thought we'd massively fallen behind cities like Leeds,
Manchester.
Certainly Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, right? So it's a qualitative evidence base, and that's in the report. And all we can do is report back on that. On the New Statesman blog, I noticed at the last local elections, one of the commentary they were doing as the local election results were coming, and there was one quote from some commentators who was talking about the extraordinary and mysteriously low turnout in Sheffield, right? Because that was an outside view that people in Sheffield are politically engaged, they are community engaged, so he was questioning that. But I mean, we're not here, we're here to design things for Sheffield, that's as much as I can give you.
You think you put too great a presumption that all councils on the council are there for just one reason? Because, this is it, is that they want to play a leadership role and not necessarily want to be a community champion. Because, part of the premise I keep reading here is that we all want to be leaders when it's quite clearly that different people come to councils for different reasons. I just wonder whether you think you've put too great a presumption on that.
I mean, that's not the intention to give that impression. Most of the reason why people come into local politics as local councils, because they do want to serve their community. They then often get swept away into other things. And then so I would therefore ask, what are the mechanisms that can enable that to happen? And what is the shared understanding between communities and councillors about what councillors do, what people can expect from representation, what they can, right? It's that kind of, that understanding and that connecting up again.
That's why we were so amazed that the Centre for Public Scrutiny or other experts weren't, more of the city weren't involved in this journey that you're going along now to understand the different models of governance and what they could maybe lend to the city. So if you help people gain that understanding of what they can get from the different models, then if people think that they can change things, then, and I can't back up what I'm saying with any stats, then I think, they will bother to get out and vote.
Because I totally agree. I can't understand why we're not involved. This is before I was on the council, in that year, a year ago, Because one of the things I've done, you know, I keep reading, one of the things I keep saying about, whenever I see your graphs about 10 people around the city, then I see that you want it to, you know, which relies on a unanimous vote in council to get rid of proportionality, then if there is going to be some sort of proportionality, if we go to a model where we're on proportionality to the votes cast, I mean, first of all, I suppose, don't get me started on that. But the whole point is that instead of having 10 councillors in the city, we'll have 8 councillors in effect being on virtually every committee. But it'll just be a different party, and that's what we'll end up with.
It depends how important it is, you think, to represent people and to represent what people have voted for in the city. Because there are practical problems associated with it. You're right, and we would, and people we've talked to would massively support proportionately. There are practical problems associated with it. What are you going to do with UKIP, with the numbers who vote for that party, and how they possibly participate in a number of committees? But it depends how committed you are. And if you're committed to improving representation, which we believe should be one of the key design principles, as well as improving, delegating down to communities as much as possible, and having communities, having mechanisms for communities to participate in decision making, then those practical problems will be solved. And you know, we're just taking the brief, it's form, or whatever it is, form before function. It's the principles, and then you work out how you're going to do it.
We all have to work through the briefs, the strictures of what government legislation has left us with, and how we have to operate. So, I mean, I'm with you. Throughout my adult life is to try and get people to participate and to get people in, and that's what I want to see under whatever system we end up with, is that people are involved at the earliest possible point, and it's how we get to that is where I want to see.
It would be a huge coup for Sheffield if Sheffield introduced proportionate participation based on its electoral picture.
Thank you. Just very briefly, obviously everybody's been telling you a bit about their background, because in a way it sort of feels like sometimes people think we're all idiots. But in my previous life, I worked for 8 years for the Audit Commission, so I've actually poked around in dozens and dozens of councils, looking at their governance arrangements and so on, and I also led nationally on some of our work with district councils. So I do consider myself to actually have quite a lot of insight and expertise around governance. And all that, the big lesson from that for me actually was, don't look at the process, look at the outcomes. And that for me is the big issue about this, what outcomes that we're going to try to achieve through any changes. I think I'd like to thank you for the challenge that you've brought to us. I always think that challenge is healthy, and personally I think, you know, it's a good time actually, after being through such a battering time with austerity, that we need to sort of look at ourselves and see whether we're in the right place to carry on doing our business. But I really think that we ought to differentiate between how we do business and how we make decisions, and I think that's what a lot of my colleagues have actually been saying as well. So my question's actually about, coming back to, it links to Tim's question as well, that any of the examples that you've been giving us as sort of examples of good practice, whether there's any evidence that they have achieved better outcomes for the people of their areas, because that's the thing that really means the most to me. I do agree with you about some of the stuff. I think actually there'd be quite a lot of consensus in here, and I think people have said that about, you know, engagement, improving scrutiny, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that we would disagree about that as well, but that's not the same thing as actually throwing everything up in the air and introducing a new decision-making structure. So my key question is actually about any evidence about improved outcomes based on the stuff we've been talking about from those exemplars that you've been putting in front of us. Thank you.
Again, there is evidence in, and this would have been a key question for the Centre for Public Scrutiny or John Cade the other day, or the LGA, that various councils have claimed that they have achieved better outcomes. What the UN, on a much wider what a wider scale says, that governance mechanisms that are participatory, accountable, open, all those things that we know about governance, and that, so that are more horizontal, if you like, are associated with certainly healthier democracies, and they say with wealthier cities. And I'll give you a really practical example. One of the things we heard again and again and again and again and again was about this working in partnership, the difficulties groups found in working with the council and it being responsive and so on. And what they endlessly cited was the inability to be effective at drawing in funding from the sources that still do exist out there, because those mechanisms aren't working, right? That's what people told us again and again and again, from people who came to us and talked to us from different groups, or who happen to be involved in different groups. So the UN says that it's associated with wealthier, more productive and better democratic system, good governance. But this is a question. I mean, I can go away and prepare something, but this is really a question for the Centre for Public Scrutiny and the LGA. We can tell you what people told, and it's supplemented with our own knowledge that we've drawn in on that.
Yeah, I think also, anecdotally again, with our contact with other groups who have brought petitions in different councils or run campaigns along the similar lines, that many of them do say that there has been a significant difference. But again, that's anecdotal. There's no survey that they did to prove what they said, but that's what they told us.
I'd just like to also say to you, there's all sorts of stuff here that we could have, long and meaningful discussions about. But I actually think you've completely underestimated some of the work that takes place in scrutiny, and certainly my scrutiny committee. And I think even if you wanted to watch the streaming of yesterday's committee meeting, you'll see that in fact it is very focused on people, and that we do encourage people who are representative of carers groups and so on to attend the meeting, and also we get direct evidence from a voluntary sector group in order to contribute and inform our decision making. So I'm not saying that mine's absolutely special. I just think you've completely underestimated the work that some of our scrutiny committees have been undertaking.
No, I think I haven't underestimated it at all. I think it's fantastic, some of the work that's gone in. What I'm saying is there is not clear evidence of impact. And also, there is a very stark picture of the public and the community sector, and I would say even the voluntary sector. I found one meeting where Voluntary Action Sheffield had come. I mean, we looked at the minutes of scrutiny over 2 years. There was one meeting where Voluntary Action Sheffield, the big umbrella organisation that I could find, was in attendance. And that exclusion, and you can say, well, councillors are there to represent, and there are general references made. No, I'm not underestimating. I'm saying it's wasted, the work you're doing. It is not valued enough, and it's not being, it's not having the impact it should be having.
While we're on about backgrounds, I was born in Attercliffe in 1954. The first job I had was a hod carrier, and the second job was driving an overhead crane in a steelworks. And out of all of that, I managed to get a degree in French. Yeah. Douglas.
Thanks, Mick. I meant to top that. I've not got a degree in French. But, I was only going to ask one question, partly too because of time, and also because you don't need to convince me. But actually, I think just the last point was a good one in what you were saying, because I think a lot of us experience that what happens in scrutiny is actually quite good in terms of discussion, and you see the benefits of cross-party work and also people focusing on the job in hand. What it doesn't do is change the decision, because in practice the decision has just always been made and people go away with having had a sense of had a good discussion. But that's just my observation. I just want to throw that in. The question really was, I think when you were talking before, you were talking about quite a wide-ranging set of things that would improve the functioning of the council, one of which was governance, but there was also community development and area working, And so, one way forward would put, a significant increase in resources into community working in the council by taking it away from somewhere else. There's also the issue of, personal conduct, the bullying and aggression and all the sort of nastiness that we all say shouldn't happen. That would take something else to change, and that would probably rely on some personal changes. And then there's the structural change of the governance. So really the question is, to what extent can those be separated to achieve what we identify as, a far better way forward? So in other words, if the council put significantly more resource into community working and, actually was much more proactive in that sense, and it also, if there was a step change in elected members and officers' personal conduct, would there still be a need for a change of governance from a strong leader to a committee model, in your views?
One of the things we put in our design principles was about it could be done without spending money. And the reason we put that in is because we've been wary of a couple of reports where people say, oh, it'll cost more money, or this will happen, or that will happen. It doesn't need to when it's up and running. I think there may well be transition costs associated with moving to a modern committee system, as we fully expect people will vote for. But I'm not averse to there being investment. I mean, it is again about purpose, and and if there is money, it would have been much, then, and money's been spent on all kinds of things, and many people will tell you, well, it's been spent on court cases, it's spent on this, and it's spent on that, yeah, there of course there's money. No one's averse to investment being made, and this building of bridges and building of connections, because in one sense the only way we'll improve governance is actually if we talk to each other more, if we understand each other more and the roles and so on and so forth, and that people can see that their voice and influence can have some kind of impact. I mean, Sheffield's a classic city, and there are all kinds of things you could do, because when you're talking about inequalities and some of the most unequal communities, you will have to incentivize it. Why can't we offer, like, bits and pieces of money for communities to be more engaged and individual community members to enable them to participate and be part of decision-making structures at a local level? We should be doing that. And it's major change, and it's the thinking through. I mean, we're an unfunded community group. We didn't know what we were coming today. It's intimidating. I mean, okay, I'm used to this kind of format. No one said, have you got any expenses? It's that kind of thought and care, because the poorest communities aren't going to be able to do that. And there's a lot of work. And as I say, as I understand, that service is in review and has been in review for 2 years. And they could be linking up and doing all that work.
Okay, I think that's given that a fairly, Ruth, if you wouldn't, I have trouble with the I know. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for your contributions. We have gone slightly over the length of time that you were allocated, but I've kept looking at Nigel, and Nigel's kept saying it's okay, so he's not upset. I'll just say a couple of comments myself. I mean, you made several references to the fact that 9% about the Labour groups being controlling everything on the basis of 9%. Well, you've only got 5% on your petition, and I would genuinely ask you to reflect on the comments that you made about the other 95%, because they do need to be participating in this process, and we should not be making any decisions on the basis of 5%. We should also be listening to the people who won't be able to vote in the referendum, and some of those will be coming to talk to us a little later, because they will be living under that new scheme for at least 10 years.
Mick, I know you are famous for your comments about the 95%, and I agree that every effort should be made to get comment from as broad a range of people as possible. It will never be the full 100% of the population, because that never happens. Otherwise, we would be going out and asking the 70% that don't vote whether they approve of the decision that the 30% made. So in that sense, we have to take this as a representative sample of the population, and hope that by doing more and more of this type of scrutiny and this type of engagement with the public, we actually get more people to engage from an earlier stage, including at the voting stage.